On the morning of September 23, 1851, a hunting party in the remote Adirondack wilderness of upstate New York stumbled upon a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside a crude log cabin, barely visible through the dense forest canopy, they found a boy of perhaps 12 years old, emaciated and wild-eyed, speaking in sounds that resembled no human language they had ever heard. The child's words flowed in strange rhythms, punctuated by clicks and guttural sounds that seemed to belong more to the animal kingdom than to any civilized tongue. What made this discovery even more disturbing was the evidence scattered throughout the cabin. Fragments of bone arranged in deliberate patterns, strange carved symbols covering every surface of the walls, and a collection of handwritten journals documenting practices that defied all Christian decency. The authorities who investigated the scene were so disturbed by what they uncovered that most records were sealed immediately, hidden away in county archives where they remain to this day, classified under a simple notation: Harwick Incident. Access restricted by order of the state. Before we continue with the story of Benjamin Harwick and the language that should never have existed, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. You might be surprised how many dark secrets your own region holds buried in forgotten archives. The discovery of Benjamin Harwick would become one of the most disturbing cases in New York State's early medical records, a testament to how isolation and desperation could transform a family into something that challenged the very definition of human civilization. The year 1851 found the Adirondack region of New York State caught between two worlds, suspended in a tension that would prove crucial to understanding the Harwick family's terrible transformation. While cities like Albany and New York were embracing the Industrial Revolution, with steamships churning up the Hudson River and telegraph lines connecting distant communities, the vast wilderness areas remained largely untamed, home to scattered settlements of trappers, loggers, and families seeking to escape the complications of an increasingly connected society. The Adirondack wilderness in those days stretched for hundreds of square miles of virtually uncharted territory, broken only by ancient Indian trails and the occasional logging camp. It was a landscape that could swallow entire families without trace, where a man might live his entire life without encountering another soul beyond his immediate kin. The mountains rose in endless green waves, their valleys hidden beneath canopies so thick that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. Streams and lakes lay scattered throughout like jewels in the green darkness, many of them unmapped and unnamed, known only to the native peoples who had hunted these lands for centuries before white settlement. The Harwick family had been among the pioneer settlers who sought refuge in this wilderness, arriving in the region during the harsh winter of 1836. Ezra Harwick had been a man of contradictions from the beginning. Educated and articulate, yet driven by an almost pathological need to escape what he perceived as the corruption of civilized society. Born in Vermont to a family of modest means, he had worked as a schoolteacher in small towns throughout New England before meeting and marrying Sarah Pemberton, the daughter of a failed merchant from Connecticut. Sarah brought to the marriage not only her own education, rare for women of her generation, but also a small inheritance that would prove crucial to their frontier ambitions. More importantly, she shared Ezra's growing disillusionment with the rapid changes transforming American society. The couple had witnessed the social upheavals of the 1830s, the financial panics that destroyed honest families overnight, and the growing materialism that seemed to be replacing traditional values. Their decision to seek isolation was not merely practical, but philosophical. They believed they could create a purer form of human existence, free from the corrupting influences of commerce and social convention. Their chosen location reflected both careful planning and dangerous isolation. The valley they selected lay hidden behind a series of ridges that formed a natural barrier against casual discovery. Access required navigating a treacherous mountain pass that was often impassable during winter months, while the valley itself was small enough to be easily defended, but large enough to support basic agriculture. A clear stream ran through the center, providing fresh water year-round, while the surrounding slopes offered abundant game and timber. For the first several years, the Harwick family represented a remarkable success story of frontier self-sufficiency. Ezra proved surprisingly adaptable to wilderness life, learning hunting and trapping skills that supplemented his basic knowledge of farming. Sarah mastered the complex arts of food preservation, herbal medicine, and the dozens of survival skills necessary for isolated living. Their first child, Benjamin, was born in 1839 during a particularly harsh winter, delivered by his father with only Sarah's mother's medical books as guidance. The birth of Benjamin marked a turning point in the family's relationship with the outside world. Ezra became increasingly protective of his growing family, viewing each contact with other settlers as a potential threat to their carefully constructed paradise. When traders or hunters occasionally discovered their hidden valley, Ezra received them with polite but cold hospitality, making it clear that visitors were not welcome to extend their stays. 2 daughters followed Benjamin's birth, Martha in 1841 and Rebecca in 1844. Each birth seemed to deepen Ezra's conviction that his family represented something precious and unique that must be protected from outside contamination. He began developing elaborate theories about the corrupting influence of social contact, arguing to Sarah that their children were growing up pure and natural in ways that civilized children could never achieve. The family's education became a central focus of Ezra's attention. Using the small library of books they had brought from Vermont, he conducted daily lessons that went far beyond basic literacy and mathematics. Benjamin and his sisters were taught philosophy, natural history, and what Ezra called true moral reasoning, a system of ethics based on his own interpretations of natural law rather than traditional religious doctrine. As the children grew, Ezra's teaching methods became increasingly unconventional. He argued that normal language was corrupted by the false concepts of civilization, filled with words and ideas that prevented clear thinking about natural human relationships. He began experimenting with modified vocabulary, eliminating terms that he considered artificially imposed by society and replacing them with words that he claimed represented more fundamental truths about human nature. The last confirmed contact between the Harwick family and the outside world occurred in the spring of 1847, when Ezra made his final trading expedition to the logging town of Newcomb. The merchant who dealt with him, Jeremiah Foster, later recalled that conversation in detail when questioned by investigators. Ezra had seemed agitated and spoke at length about protecting his family from what he called the contamination of corrupt minds. He purchased unusual supplies, large quantities of salt, metal knives, and several medical texts dealing with anatomy and surgical procedures. Foster remembered being struck by Ezra's changed appearance. The man who had visited his store sporadically over the previous decade had always been thin but healthy, with the weathered look of someone adapted to outdoor life. But in 1847, Ezra appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, with an intensity that made Foster uncomfortable. Most disturbing of all, Ezra seemed to have developed peculiar speech patterns, occasionally using words that Foster didn't recognize, and speaking in rhythms that sounded almost foreign. When Foster inquired about the family's welfare, Ezra's response had been chilling in its intensity. He spoke of the great work that he was conducting with his family, a process of purification that would allow them to transcend the limitations imposed by corrupted civilization. He mentioned that his children were learning the true language of natural existence, a form of communication that would allow them to understand reality without the distortions created by artificial social concepts. After that encounter, the Harwick family seemed to vanish entirely from the awareness of the outside world. Trappers and hunters who had occasionally glimpsed smoke from their valley reported seeing nothing for months at a time. Some assumed the family had moved deeper into the wilderness or perhaps returned to civilization. Others wondered if they had fallen victim to the harsh realities of frontier life, disease, accident, or attack by the few hostile native bands that still roamed the deep wilderness. What actually happened during those 4 years of complete isolation would only be pieced together much later, through careful analysis of the journals found in their cabin and the painstaking process of learning to communicate with young Benjamin. The transformation that occurred in that remote valley would challenge every assumption about the stability of human nature and the power of isolation to reshape the fundamental structures of consciousness itself. The hunting party that discovered Benjamin consisted of 3 men whose backgrounds would prove crucial to understanding and documenting what they found. James Culver served as both a successful merchant in the growing town of North Creek and an appointed constable responsible for maintaining order in the scattered settlements of the region. His brother-in-law, Thomas Brennan, had spent the better part of 2 decades learning the ways of the Adirondack wilderness, first as a logger and later as a guide for hunting parties from the cities. The third member of their group, Dr. William Schuyler, had joined the expedition primarily to collect specimens of medicinal plants that were rumored to grow in the high mountain meadows. But his medical training would soon prove invaluable in ways none of them could have anticipated. They had been following an old deer trail that wound through some of the most remote terrain in the region, tracking a particularly large buck that Brennan insisted would provide meat enough to last his family through the coming winter. The trail led them higher into the mountains than any of them had ventured before, through stands of ancient pine and hemlock that created a green twilight even at midday. The silence of the deep forest was broken only by their own footsteps and the occasional call of birds invisible in the canopy above. It was Brennan who first noticed the anomaly that would lead them to the Harwick cabin. Smoke was rising from what should have been an uninhabited portion of the forest, a thin grey column that seemed to emerge from the very heart of the wilderness. In territory this remote, any sign of human habitation was unusual enough to warrant investigation. But as they approached the source of the smoke, following game trails that seemed to have been subtly modified to create a pathway, other signs began to accumulate that suggested something far from normal. The smell hit them first, a sickly, sweet odor that seemed to hang in the still September air like an invisible fog. Brennan, experienced in the ways of the wilderness and familiar with the sense of death and decay that were part of natural cycles, recognized it immediately as the smell of carrion. But something else lingered beneath it that made his stomach turn and his skin crawl. It was a human smell, the distinctive odor of unwashed bodies and confined living, but mixed with something else that he couldn't identify and didn't want to contemplate. As they pushed through increasingly dense undergrowth, other disturbing signs began to appear. Trees bore strange markings, not the random scratches left by animals, but deliberate cuts that formed symbols and patterns. Some appeared to be crude pictographs depicting human figures in various poses, while others resembled geometric designs that seemed to follow some incomprehensible logic. Most disturbing of all, many of the markings appeared to have been filled with a dark substance that could only be dried blood, creating a trail of cryptic messages that led deeper into the forest. The cabin, when they finally located it through the maze of undergrowth and fallen trees, appeared to have been constructed from whatever materials the forest could provide, but with a level of craftsmanship that suggested considerable skill and planning. Crude logs held together with clay and moss formed the walls, while the roof consisted of bark and animal hides stretched over rough-hewn beams. What made the structure particularly unsettling was the way it seemed to blend with its surroundings, as if it had been deliberately designed to remain hidden from casual observation. Around the cabin's perimeter, more symbols had been carved into trees and scratched into rocks, creating a circle of cryptic markings that seemed to serve some ritualistic purpose. Bones of various animals hung from branches like macabre decorations, while the ground itself had been disturbed in patterns that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than random use. The door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the afternoon breeze. Culver called out in his official capacity as constable, announcing their presence and asking if anyone within required assistance. The response that came from inside the cabin froze all 3 men in their tracks. It was clearly a human voice, young and high-pitched, but the sounds it made bore no resemblance to English or any other language they had ever encountered. The vocalizations flowed together in rapid bursts, punctuated by clicking sounds made with the tongue, and what could only be described as controlled grunts and growls. The rhythm and intonation suggested communication rather than random noise, but the linguistic structure was completely alien. Most unsettling of all, the voice seemed to be responding to their presence, growing more animated and urgent, as if trying to convey some vital information. Dr. Schuyler was the first to recover from his shock, his medical training overriding his fear and revulsion. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, with Culver and Brennan following reluctantly behind. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit only by a small fire smoldering in a crude stone hearth that filled the single room with acrid smoke and dancing shadows. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw him. A boy who appeared to be around 12 years old, though severe malnutrition and the effects of prolonged isolation made accurate age assessment difficult. His hair hung in matted tangles to his shoulders, dark with grease and dirt, while his clothing consisted entirely of animal skins sewn together with sinew and decorated with more of the mysterious symbols they had observed outside. The child sat cross-legged in the center of the single room, surrounded by an elaborate arrangement of objects that defied immediate understanding. Bones of various sizes had been arranged in intricate geometric patterns around him, some clearly animal bones, but others that made the three men exchange uneasy glances. Carved wooden tokens bearing the same symbols found throughout the forest completed the display, along with what appeared to be crude tools made from sharpened bone and metal, salvaged from unknown sources. When he saw the strangers, the boy's speech became more animated and urgent, his voice rising and falling in patterns that suggested complex grammatical structures, even as the actual words remained incomprehensible. He gestured frequently toward different areas of the cabin, as if trying to explain something of vital importance, his movements following what appeared to be systematic rules rather than random expression. But it was the walls of the cabin that truly revealed the horror of what had transpired in this isolated place. Every surface had been carved with symbols and designs, hundreds of them ranging from simple lines and circles to complex geometric patterns that seemed to follow some alien logic. The carvings covered not just the walls, but the ceiling and floor, creating an environment where normal spatial relationships seemed distorted and threatening. Some of the symbols appeared to be pictographs depicting human figures in various activities, hunting, gathering, and other scenes that might have been normal except for details that suggested practices far removed from civilized behavior. Other markings resembled no recognizable form of writing or artistic expression, consisting of abstract patterns that seemed designed to convey concepts that normal human language could not express. Most disturbing of all, many of the carvings had been filled with dark substances that examination would later confirm to be human blood, mixed with charcoal and animal fat. The combination created permanent markings that seemed to pulse and move in the flickering firelight, giving the entire interior of the cabin an atmosphere of malevolent intelligence. Dr. Schuyler knelt beside the boy, speaking in gentle tones and trying to assess his physical condition while avoiding any sudden movements that might frighten him further. The child responded with more of his incomprehensible language, occasionally pointing to different areas of the cabin and making gestures that seemed to follow complex rules of meaning and association. The boy's physical condition was alarming. Severe malnutrition had left him gaunt and hollow-eyed, while his skin showed evidence of exposure to extreme conditions and possible deliberate scarification. His teeth had been modified in ways that Dr. Schuyler found deeply disturbing, filed to points that would be more effective for tearing meat than for normal eating. Most unsettling of all, the boy seemed completely comfortable with his situation, showing no signs of distress or desire for rescue. As Culver and Brennan explored the rest of the small dwelling, they discovered evidence that transformed the mystery from strange to horrifying. In one corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of animal furs, they found a collection of bound journals written in clear, educated English. The handwriting was elegant and precise, suggesting that the author possessed significant learning and had been of sound mind when the earlier entries were written. However, even a cursory examination of the journal contents revealed a progressive descent into madness and practices that violated every principle of civilized society. The early entries described normal frontier family life, hunting expeditions, crop cultivation, and the education of children in basic academic subjects. But as the journals progressed, the writing began to document experiments in what the author called human refinement and the purification of natural instincts. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, their search revealed additional horrors: crude medical instruments that appeared to have been used for surgical procedures, collections of human teeth and finger bones arranged in decorative patterns, and detailed drawings of human anatomy with notations in multiple languages, including the same incomprehensible symbols that covered the walls. The immediate priority was getting Benjamin to safety and proper medical care, but the process proved far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The boy seemed genuinely terrified of leaving the cabin, not out of attachment to the place, but due to fears that he could only express in his incomprehensible language. Through gestures and increasingly frantic vocalizations, he seemed to be trying to warn his would-be rescuers about dangers that they could not understand. When Dr. Schuyler finally managed to coax him outside, Benjamin immediately began pointing back toward the cabin and speaking rapidly in what appeared to be urgent warnings about violations of important rules or taboos. His distress seemed genuine and profound, suggesting that his family's isolation had created not just linguistic barriers, but fundamental differences in understanding reality itself. The journey to North Creek required 2 full days of careful travel, as Benjamin's physical condition made rapid movement impossible. During this time, Dr. Schuyler made detailed observations of the boy's behavior and attempted various methods of communication. What emerged was clear evidence that Benjamin possessed a complete and sophisticated linguistic system. His vocalizations followed consistent grammatical patterns. He used specific gestures to supplement his spoken words, and he demonstrated understanding of complex, abstract concepts that could only be expressed through advanced language structures. More disturbing than his linguistic abilities were Benjamin's other behaviors during the journey. He showed extensive knowledge of wilderness survival techniques that went far beyond what any 12-year-old should possess, including detailed understanding of animal behavior, plant identification, and tracking skills. Most unsettling of all, he demonstrated familiarity with butchering and meat preparation techniques that suggested hands-on experience with processes that Dr. Schuyler preferred not to contemplate. The boy's relationship with food proved particularly revealing. While he would eat normally prepared provisions, he showed marked preferences for meat that was barely cooked and seemed to possess detailed knowledge of which parts of various animals were most nutritious. His eating habits followed rituals and patterns that suggested elaborate cultural training rather than simple hunger or preference. Upon reaching North Creek, Benjamin was placed in the temporary care of Reverend Samuel Houghton and his wife Elizabeth, who had experience caring for orphan children from various frontier tragedies. The Reverend's house, a substantial 2-story structure that served as both residence and informal community center, became the focus of an intensive effort to understand Benjamin's situation and determine how best to help him adapt to normal society. The initial challenges were immediately apparent. Benjamin seemed genuinely unable to comprehend basic concepts of privacy, personal property, and social hierarchy that even very young children typically understand instinctively. His attempts to communicate his needs and concerns resulted in increasingly frustrated outbursts in his artificial language, accompanied by gestures and behaviors that often frightened other children in the community. Mrs. Elizabeth Houghton, a patient woman with considerable experience dealing with troubled children, observed that Benjamin's difficulties went far beyond simple language barriers. He seemed to operate according to social rules and moral concepts that were fundamentally different from those of normal human society. Actions that any civilized person would consider horrifying appeared to him as natural and necessary. while behaviors that others took for granted seemed to cause him genuine confusion and distress. Dr. Schuyler sent detailed letters to colleagues in Albany and New York City describing the unique linguistic and psychological challenges presented by Benjamin's case. His correspondence painted a picture of a child who had been systematically trained in ways of thinking and behaving that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and social development. The response to Dr. Schuyler's inquiries came from Professor Marcus Delacroix of Columbia College, a scholar of comparative linguistics who had spent years studying isolated language communities throughout Europe and the American frontier. Professor Delacroix had encountered numerous cases of linguistic isolation and cultural adaptation, but Benjamin's situation represented something entirely unprecedented in his experience. Upon arriving in North Creek in late October 1851, Professor Delacroix immediately recognized that Benjamin's language was not simply a corrupted form of English or a mixture of various dialects encountered during trading expeditions. The linguistic structure, vocabulary, and grammatical patterns suggested a completely artificial language that had been created with specific intentions and systematic methodology. The professor's initial assessment confirmed Dr. Schuyler's observations while adding new layers of complexity to the mystery. Benjamin's artificial language appeared to be designed not just for communication but for shaping thought processes in fundamental ways. The vocabulary included extensive terminology for concepts that had no equivalent in normal human languages, while completely lacking words for ideas and relationships that every human society considered essential. Most significantly, the language seemed to have been designed to make certain moral and social concepts literally unthinkable. Benjamin possessed no vocabulary for individual rights, personal autonomy, or moral objection to authority. His linguistic framework made it impossible for him to express concepts like injustice, cruelty, or violation of natural law. The language had been crafted to ensure absolute compliance with whatever social system had created it. As Professor Delacroix began the painstaking process of creating basic communication through gestures and simple objects, disturbing patterns in Benjamin's worldview became apparent. His understanding of human relationships seemed to be based entirely on hierarchies of dominance and submission, with no concept of mutual respect or cooperation between equals. His knowledge of natural processes focused heavily on death, decay, and transformation, with sophisticated vocabulary for various stages of decomposition and physical breakdown. Meanwhile, the journals recovered from the cabin were being analyzed by Dr. Schuyler, Reverend Houghton, and several other educated members of the community. What they revealed was a systematic record of one man's descent into madness and the deliberate destruction of his family's humanity. Ezra Harwick's early entries described the normal challenges and satisfactions of frontier family life, but gradually revealed an increasingly disturbed mind fixated on themes of purity, transformation, and what he called the liberation of natural human instincts. The journals documented Ezra's growing conviction that normal human society was based on artificial concepts that prevented people from achieving their true potential. He wrote extensively about the corruption of conventional language and the need to create new forms of communication that would allow humans to transcend the limitations imposed by civilization. The most disturbing entries began appearing in late 1848, roughly 3 years into the family's complete isolation from outside contact. Ezra described receiving what he called revelations during long winter nights, insights into the true nature of human existence that contradicted everything he had previously believed about morality and social organization. He began developing elaborate theories about the artificial nature of conventional moral systems and the need to strip away civilized conditioning to reveal humanity's authentic nature. These philosophical developments were accompanied by increasingly extreme changes in the family's daily life. Ezra instituted rigid dietary restrictions that he claimed would purify his family's physical and spiritual essence, followed by elaborate rituals designed to break down what he saw as artificial social conditioning. The journals described systematic programs of isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological pressure designed to remake his wife and children according to his evolving vision of human perfection. As autumn deepened into the harsh Adirondack winter, Professor Delacroix made a series of breakthroughs in understanding Benjamin's language that sent shockwaves through the small community of scholars and officials who had become involved in the case. The boy's artificial tongue was revealing itself to be far more sophisticated and disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. A complete linguistic system designed not merely to facilitate communication, but to fundamentally reshape human consciousness itself. The first major breakthrough came during a session where Benjamin was attempting to explain what had happened to his sisters Martha and Rebecca. Using a combination of his verbal language, the carved wooden tokens found in the cabin, and increasingly sophisticated gestural communication, he began to relate a story that Professor Delacroix could only partially comprehend. The linguistic structure suggested that Benjamin was describing not simply events that had occurred, but transformational processes that had been deliberately applied to human beings. The artificial language contained extensive vocabulary for concepts related to physical and psychological transformation, but described these processes in terms that made them seem natural and beneficial rather than horrifying. Benjamin could discuss in clinical detail procedures that any normal person would consider torture or mutilation, but his linguistic framework prevented him from understanding why others found his accounts disturbing. Professor Delacroix's analysis revealed that the language had been designed with remarkable sophistication to eliminate moral categories that might interfere with absolute obedience to authority. There were no words for concepts like cruelty, injustice, or unnecessary suffering. Actions were classified only according to their effectiveness in achieving specified goals, with no linguistic framework for evaluating whether those goals themselves were morally acceptable. Dr. Schuyler, who had continued his analysis of the physical evidence from the cabin throughout the winter months, made discoveries that provided crucial context for understanding Benjamin's linguistic revelations. A more thorough search of the cabin site had revealed additional caches of materials hidden beneath the structure and in the surrounding forest. More journals, crude surgical instruments, and collections of human remains that had been carefully processed and preserved. The later journals revealed the full extent of Ezra Harwick's transformation from educated frontiersman to something that challenged the definition of human. Beginning in 1849, his entries described what he called the Great Work, a systematic program of what he termed purification that he had begun implementing with his family. The process had started with extreme dietary restrictions and isolation rituals, but had gradually evolved into practices that defied comprehension. Ezra had become convinced that normal human society was fundamentally corrupted by what he called false consciousness, artificial mental structures that prevented people from recognizing their true nature and potential. His solution was not simply to reject civilization, but to systematically deconstruct and rebuild human consciousness from its foundations, creating what he described as perfected beings, capable of transcending normal human limitations. The creation of the artificial language was central to this process. Ezra's journals described in detail his methodology for eliminating corrupt concepts from his family's thinking while introducing new categories of thought that would support his vision of human transformation. The language was designed to make resistance psychologically impossible by eliminating the conceptual framework necessary for moral objection or independent thought. Benjamin's linguistic education had been accompanied by systematic physical and psychological conditioning that had transformed him into something barely recognizable as a normal human child. The journals revealed that Ezra had used a combination of starvation, sensory deprivation, and carefully applied physical punishment to break down Benjamin's original personality and replace it with something more suitable to his purposes. The boy's sisters, Martha and Rebecca, had apparently been the first subjects of Ezra's most extreme experiments in human transformation. The journals described elaborate procedures that Ezra claimed would allow them to transcend normal human limitations and achieve a higher form of existence. These procedures involved systematic consumption of human tissue, not as a desperate survival measure, but as a central ritual in Ezra's artificial religion. Professor Delacroix's analysis of Benjamin's language revealed that it contained extensive vocabulary related to cannibalistic practices, but described them in terms that made them seem sacred and necessary rather than horrifying. The linguistic structure actually prevented Benjamin from expressing concepts like disgust, horror, or moral objection to the consumption of human flesh. He could describe the physical processes involved in clinical detail, but lacked the conceptual framework to understand why others found them disturbing. As winter progressed and Benjamin's gradual acquisition of English allowed him to provide more detailed accounts of his family's final years, a picture emerged of systematic abuse and conditioning that had transformed a normal frontier family into something that defied classification. Ezra had convinced his wife and children that their survival and spiritual advancement depended on embracing practices that violated every principle of civilized society. The process had been gradual and systematic, with each transgression presented as a necessary step toward a higher form of existence. Sarah Harwick, initially resistant to her husband's increasingly extreme demands, had been gradually worn down through a combination of isolation, psychological pressure, and carefully applied physical coercion, until she became an active participant in practices that would have horrified her former self. Benjamin's account, filtered through his artificial language and gradually translated into English, revealed that his mother had eventually become Ezra's most devoted assistant in the systematic destruction of their children's humanity. She had participated willingly in the creation of the artificial language and had helped implement the conditioning programs that had transformed Martha and Rebecca from normal children into victims of their parents' madness. The boys' gradual acquisition of English vocabulary allowed Professor Delacroix to understand the full scope of Ezra's great work. The Harwick family had not simply descended into cannibalism as a survival measure, but had developed a complete philosophical and practical system for the systematic consumption of human beings as a means of achieving what Ezra described as transcendence of natural limitations. Benjamin had been designated as the intended survivor and inheritor of this system, systematically trained not just in the techniques of human consumption, but in the psychological methods necessary to identify suitable victims and break down their resistance. His education had been designed to make him a highly effective predator, capable of appearing normal while systematically targeting and manipulating potential victims. The breakthrough that would unlock the full horror of Benjamin's story came from an unexpected source that winter. Mrs. Elizabeth Houghton, who had been patiently caring for Benjamin in the Reverend's household, began noticing patterns in the boy's behavior that went far beyond his obvious linguistic and cultural differences. Her observations would prove crucial to understanding the true extent of Ezra Harwick's systematic destruction of his family's humanity. During mealtimes, Benjamin exhibited behaviors that initially seemed like simple preferences or habits acquired during his family's isolation. He showed particular interest in any meat that was even slightly undercooked, examining it carefully before eating and making comments in his artificial language that Professor Delacroix was gradually learning to interpret. More disturbing still, Benjamin demonstrated detailed knowledge of butchering and meat preparation techniques that extended far beyond what any 12-year-old should possess, regardless of frontier upbringing. Mrs. Houghton noticed that Benjamin seemed to categorize different types of meat according to criteria that had nothing to do with normal culinary considerations. He would examine beef, pork, and venison with the intense focus of an expert evaluating quality, making distinctions that seemed to be based on factors like age, health, and what he called in his broken English, the fear taste, a concept that made Mrs. Houghton's blood run cold when she finally understood its implications. Even more alarming were Benjamin's interactions with other children in the community. During his carefully supervised visits to the church for Sunday services, he had begun attempting to teach elements of his artificial language to younger children, presenting what he clearly considered essential survival knowledge. Mrs. Houghton observed him trying to share detailed information about what he called preparation methods and selection criteria, knowledge that seemed designed to enable the systematic identification and processing of human victims. When Mrs. Houghton reported these incidents to Professor Delacroix, he realized that Benjamin's education in his family's practices had been far more comprehensive and systematic than anyone had initially understood. The boy had not simply been a victim of his family's descent into cannibalism. He had been systematically trained as a participant and, ultimately, as the intended perpetuator of Ezra's great work. Professor Delacroix arranged for a series of carefully controlled sessions where Benjamin would be encouraged to share his knowledge using his increasingly sophisticated English vocabulary combined with his artificial language. What emerged from these sessions painted a picture of horror that challenged the comprehension of everyone involved. Benjamin had been systematically educated in techniques for identifying, capturing, and processing human beings for consumption, with his training including detailed psychological methods for breaking down victims' resistance and converting them to participation in their own destruction. The artificial language contained elaborate terminology for different categories of human beings based on their suitability for various purposes. Benjamin could distinguish between what he called quick meat, victims intended for immediate consumption, and long meat, those who would be kept alive for extended periods while being systematically processed. His vocabulary included detailed classifications based on age, physical condition, psychological resilience, and what he described as flavor potential, factors that determined how victims would be utilized. Most horrifying of all, Benjamin's linguistic framework included extensive terminology for the psychological techniques used to convert victims from resistance to willing participation. Ezra's system had included methods for gradually breaking down a person's sense of individual identity and moral autonomy, replacing these with artificial concepts that made cooperation with their own destruction seem logical and necessary. Just when the full scope of the Harwick family's practices was becoming clear, a discovery at the original cabin site provided the most disturbing revelation yet. A late autumn storm had caused a significant landslide near the valley where the cabin stood, exposing what appeared to be a carefully constructed underground chamber that had been completely hidden during the initial investigation. James Culver, who had continued to monitor the site throughout the winter, led a second expedition to investigate this new discovery. What they found in the underground chamber transformed the case from a horrifying example of family madness to evidence of systematic predation that had extended far beyond the Harwick family itself. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale that challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of human depravity. The underground chamber contained the carefully arranged remains of at least 8 individuals, processed and stored according to methods that demonstrated systematic organization and long-term planning. The remains showed clear evidence of deliberate dismemberment and preparation using techniques that Benjamin's artificial language described in clinical detail. Most horrifying of all, the evidence suggested that some of the victims had been members of trading parties or travelers who had encountered the Harwick family during their years of supposed isolation. What had initially appeared to be a case of a family driven to cannibalism by desperation and madness was revealed to be something far more sinister, a systematic program of predation that had been conducted with careful planning and methodical execution. The Harwick family had not simply consumed each other in a final act of desperation, but had been actively hunting and processing other human beings for consumption over a period of several years. Dr. Schuyler's analysis of the remains, combined with Benjamin's increasingly detailed accounts, revealed that Ezra Harwick had developed what could only be described as a comprehensive philosophy and methodology of human predation. The practice was not driven by starvation or survival necessity, but by a twisted belief system that presented the consumption of human flesh as a means of achieving spiritual and physical transcendence. The revelation that the Harwick family had been actively hunting other human beings transformed the case from a tragic example of isolation-induced madness to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in New York State's history. The authorities faced the unprecedented challenge of how to handle a 12-year-old boy who had been systematically trained in practices that violated every principle of civilized society, while simultaneously grappling with evidence of crimes that challenged their understanding of human nature itself. Further investigation of the underground chamber revealed a level of organization and planning that suggested the Harwick family's predatory activities had been conducted with careful methodology over an extended period. The remains were stored according to a systematic classification system that Benjamin's artificial language described in meticulous detail, with different categories based on factors that normal human beings would find impossible to contemplate. Benjamin's accounts revealed that his family had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and approaching potential victims. Ezra had used his educated background and apparent respectability to gain the trust of travelers and traders, presenting himself as a helpful guide or knowledgeable local resident. The family's hidden valley provided an ideal location for these activities, as victims could be lured there under various pretexts without arousing suspicion from outside authorities. The psychological techniques used to break down victims' resistance were particularly sophisticated, involving a gradual process of isolation, disorientation, and systematic destruction of their normal conceptual frameworks. Benjamin's language included detailed terminology for different stages of this process, describing how normal human beings could be systematically converted from independent individuals to willing participants in their own destruction. Most disturbing of all, the evidence suggested that some victims had indeed been successfully converted, adopting elements of the artificial language and participating in the family's cannibalistic rituals before ultimately being consumed themselves. This pattern indicated that Ezra's methods were far more psychologically sophisticated and effective than anyone had initially understood, representing a systematic approach to breaking down human resistance that could potentially be applied to virtually anyone given sufficient time and isolation. The final revelation of the Harwick case came during a series of sessions in late December 1851. When Benjamin had acquired enough English vocabulary to provide a coherent and comprehensive account of his family's final months. What he revealed was so disturbing that Professor Delacroix initially refused to believe it, despite the mounting linguistic and physical evidence that supported every detail of Benjamin's testimony. According to the boy's account, his father Ezra had not died of natural causes, disease, or external threats, as the investigators had initially assumed. Instead, Benjamin revealed that his father had been systematically consumed by the surviving family members, including Benjamin himself, as part of what Ezra had described as the ultimate purification, the final step in their transformation from normal human beings to what he called perfected predators. This act of familial cannibalism was not a desperate survival measure undertaken during a harsh winter or food shortage, but rather the culmination of years of psychological conditioning and the central ritual of Ezra's twisted philosophy. The artificial language had been specifically designed to make this ultimate transgression seem not only acceptable, but necessary and sacred, the logical conclusion of everything the family had learned and practiced. Benjamin described the process in clinical detail, using vocabulary that treated the consumption of his own father as a religious duty rather than an unthinkable horror. His linguistic framework literally prevented him from understanding why others found his account disturbing, as the artificial language contained no concepts for filial loyalty, moral horror, or the sanctity of family relationships that would make such actions comprehensible as violations of natural law. The boy's account revealed that the decision to consume Ezra had been presented not as murder or even euthanasia, but as a voluntary sacrifice that Ezra himself had planned and orchestrated. The process had been conducted according to elaborate rituals designed to maximize what Ezra claimed would be the spiritual and physical benefits of incorporating his essential qualities into his family members. But the most horrifying aspect of Benjamin's revelation was yet to come. As his English vocabulary expanded and Professor Delacroix continued his linguistic analysis, it became clear that Benjamin had been systematically prepared to serve as the sole survivor and inheritor of his family's great work. His sisters, Martha and Rebecca, had not died of disease, accident, or starvation, as investigators had initially assumed based on the apparent absence of their remains from the cabin. Instead, Benjamin revealed that his sisters had been systematically consumed by the family as part of their progression through what Ezra called the stages of purification. The process had been conducted over an extended period, with each stage designed to further break down the family's connection to normal human moral concepts while reinforcing their commitment to Ezra's artificial belief system. Benjamin had been spared this fate not out of parental affection or random chance, but because Ezra had identified him as the most promising candidate to continue their practices and spread their artificial language to others. The boy's psychological makeup and physical characteristics had made him an ideal subject for the most intensive conditioning, while his sisters had been deemed more suitable for what Ezra euphemistically called transcendence through incorporation. The systematic consumption of Martha and Rebecca had been conducted according to Ezra's carefully developed methodology, with different parts of their bodies being utilized for different purposes according to his twisted theories about the spiritual and physical benefits of human consumption. Benjamin's artificial language contained extensive terminology for these practices, describing them in terms that made them seem like elaborate medical or spiritual procedures rather than acts of horrific violence. The underground chamber's additional remains were revealed to be victims of what Ezra had called recruitment operations, systematic hunting expeditions designed to capture travelers and traders who could be subjected to the same purification processes that had destroyed Benjamin's sisters. Some victims had been consumed relatively quickly, but others had been kept alive for extended periods while Ezra attempted to break down their psychological resistance and convert them to willing participation in their own destruction. Benjamin's account revealed that several of these victims had initially resisted but had eventually begun to participate in their own degradation, adopting elements of the artificial language and even assisting in the capture and processing of subsequent victims. This pattern demonstrated that Ezra's psychological techniques were effective not just on isolated family members, but on normal adults who had been systematically subjected to his methods of mental destruction. The boy's linguistic knowledge included detailed terminology for the psychological techniques used to break down resistance, methods for identifying suitable victims based on physical and psychological characteristics, and strategies for gradually introducing normal people to increasingly horrific practices without triggering complete psychological breakdown. His education had been designed to make him a highly effective predator, capable of appearing normal and trustworthy while systematically identifying and manipulating potential victims. Dr. Schuyler's medical examination revealed that Benjamin's physical development had been deliberately altered through his family's practices in ways that went far beyond simple malnutrition or environmental adaptation. His teeth showed evidence of being systematically filed and sharpened to make them more effective for tearing flesh, while his digestive system had been gradually adapted to process a diet that included significant amounts of human tissue. These physical modifications, combined with his psychological conditioning and linguistic programming, represented a systematic attempt to transform a normal human child into something approaching a different species entirely. Benjamin had been deliberately shaped to function as an apex predator within human society, equipped with the knowledge, skills, and psychological framework necessary to identify, capture, and process other human beings for consumption, while maintaining a facade of normalcy that would allow him to operate undetected. The artificial language had been designed not just to facilitate communication about these practices, but to make them seem natural and necessary to anyone who fully adopted its conceptual framework. The linguistic structure literally prevented speakers from conceiving of moral alternatives to the predatory lifestyle it described, creating a form of mental prison that made escape from Ezra's system psychologically impossible. Most chilling of all, Benjamin's education had included detailed instructions for spreading the artificial language and its associated practices to others. Ezra had envisioned his family as the beginning of a new form of human existence, with Benjamin serving as a missionary who would gradually convert others to their way of life through carefully applied psychological techniques and systematic introduction to cannibalistic practices. The Harwick case presented authorities with challenges that had no precedent in American legal, medical, or social history. Benjamin's situation defied every traditional category of understanding. He was simultaneously victim and potential perpetrator, child and monster, human being and something that had been systematically engineered to prey upon humanity itself. The artificial language had been so effective in reshaping his fundamental worldview that he literally could not comprehend why others found his family's practices horrifying or morally objectionable. Professor Delacroix's comprehensive analysis, submitted to state authorities in the spring of 1852, concluded that Benjamin represented a unique and unprecedented case in the study of human psychology, linguistics, and social development. The boy had been successfully conditioned to accept and actively participate in practices that violated every instinct of normal human behavior, while his artificial language had been designed to make recovery of conventional moral sensibilities extremely difficult, if not impossible. The linguistic system created by Ezra Harwick was recognized by Professor Delacroix as a sophisticated tool of psychological control that went far beyond simple communication. The artificial language had been specifically designed to reshape thought processes at their most fundamental level, eliminating concepts necessary for moral reasoning while reinforcing absolute compliance with the predatory lifestyle it described. The systematic nature of this mental programming represented a breakthrough in understanding how language could be used to control and reshape human consciousness. The decision regarding Benjamin's future required extensive consultation between state officials, medical experts, and religious authorities. Traditional approaches to criminal justice were clearly inadequate for dealing with a child who had been systematically trained in practices that challenged the definition of human behavior, while conventional therapeutic methods seemed unlikely to address conditioning that had been implemented over such an extended period and with such systematic thoroughness. Ultimately, the decision was made to place Benjamin in the care of the state asylum in Utica, where he would be kept under constant observation and subjected to intensive efforts to reverse his conditioning while ensuring the safety of both Benjamin himself and the broader community. Dr. Schuyler and Professor Delacroix collaborated in developing treatment methods that would gradually introduce normal language patterns and moral concepts while carefully monitoring Benjamin's psychological development. The treatment program represented one of the first systematic attempts to address what would later be recognized as severe psychological conditioning and trauma. The approach involved gradual reintroduction of normal human social concepts through carefully controlled exposure to conventional language and moral frameworks, while providing Benjamin with alternative conceptual systems that could replace his artificial linguistic programming. Benjamin's progress was slow and marked by frequent setbacks that demonstrated the profound effectiveness of his early conditioning. His artificial language had been so thoroughly integrated into his thought processes that learning normal English felt to him like losing essential knowledge rather than gaining improved communication abilities. He continued to express frustration and anxiety at being unable to convey concepts that seemed vitally important to him, but which had no equivalent in normal human language. The boy's gradual adaptation to conventional social norms required constant supervision and support, as his artificially acquired preferences and behavioral patterns remained powerful influences on his actions and decisions. Those who worked closely with him reported that he always seemed to be consciously controlling impulses and desires that came naturally to him, rather than developing genuine moral sensibilities or emotional responses that would make normal behavior feel natural and appropriate. Over the course of several years, Benjamin gradually developed the ability to function within normal social structures, though he never fully recovered from his early conditioning in ways that would allow him to form normal human relationships or experience conventional emotional responses. He learned to suppress his artificially acquired knowledge and preferences, but observers noted that this suppression seemed to require constant conscious effort rather than representing genuine psychological healing. The case files were classified by state authorities and sealed away in archives where they remain to this day, with access restricted to prevent the psychological techniques from being studied or replicated. The artificial language created by Ezra Harwick was never fully decoded beyond Professor Delacroix's basic analysis, and his research notes were classified to ensure that the methods for systematic psychological control could not be reconstructed by others. The original cabin site was deliberately destroyed, and the entire valley was declared off-limits to prevent curiosity seekers from disturbing the evidence or potentially discovering additional materials that might contain information about Ezra's methods. The underground chamber was sealed permanently, with its contents removed for secure storage in state facilities where they could be studied by authorized researchers while remaining inaccessible to the general public. Benjamin himself disappeared from official records in 1857 when he would have been approximately 18 years old. State documents from that period contain conflicting accounts of his final disposition. Some suggest he was quietly released and relocated to a distant state under a new identity, while others hint that he may have escaped from custody or been transferred to a more secure federal facility. No confirmed sightings or records of his later life have ever been located, despite periodic investigations by authorities concerned about the potential threat he might represent. The few officials who were directly involved in Benjamin's case maintained strict silence about the details throughout their lives, bound by oaths of secrecy that reflected the state's determination to prevent the Harwick methods from becoming public knowledge. Occasional references in private correspondence and official documents suggest that some authorities remained concerned about the possibility that Benjamin might attempt to implement his father's vision of spreading their practices to others. The Harwick case stands as one of the most disturbing examples in American history of how systematic psychological manipulation and extended isolation can transform normal human beings into something that challenges the very definition of humanity. It demonstrates the terrifying fragility of the social, moral, and linguistic structures that separate civilization from barbarism, while revealing the devastating power of language to shape not just communication, but the fundamental structures of human thought and moral reasoning. The questions raised by Benjamin's story continue to challenge contemporary understanding of human nature, psychological development, and the extent to which our most basic moral instincts can be artificially altered or completely destroyed through systematic conditioning. The case provides disturbing evidence that the boundary between normal human behavior and practices that violate every principle of civilized society may be far more permeable than most people would like to believe. In an era when isolation, extremism, and systematic psychological manipulation continue to produce horrific results in various forms, the Harwick case serves as a dark reminder of the depths to which human beings can sink when removed from the constraints and connections that define normal social existence. It challenges comfortable assumptions about the stability of human moral development and the reliability of the social structures that prevent the emergence of systematic predatory behavior within human communities. The artificial language created by Ezra Harwick represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case. A demonstration that human consciousness itself can be systematically reshaped through linguistic manipulation to make the most horrific practices seem natural and necessary. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond the specific circumstances of the Harwick family, suggesting possibilities for psychological control and manipulation that challenge fundamental assumptions about human autonomy and moral agency. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying monsters may not be supernatural beings or random psychopaths, but ordinary people who have been systematically transformed through circumstances and conditioning that strip away their humanity one carefully calculated step at a time. The true horror of the Harwick case lies not in its supernatural elements, for there were none, but in its demonstration that such transformation is possible within the realm of human psychology and social engineering. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or might there be other families out there who have undergone similar transformations in the isolated corners of our continent? Could Benjamin have survived to implement his father's vision of spreading their practices to others? Leave your comment below with your theories about what might have happened to the boy who spoke a language that should never have existed. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories rooted in the dark possibilities of human nature, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge our understanding of humanity itself. See you in the next video.